Thank you for joining me for this study of Lifeway, the Minor Prophets. This is session 6, and it is Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. The title is No Compassion, and the lesson summary statement is believers should celebrate God's grace being extended to all people. I'm going to start the lesson with an idea that I found in the Youth Leader's Guide, and that is I'm going to give everyone a small cupcake because this Sunday happens to be my wife's birthday, and I'm sure we'll have fun with that. At least most of us will, I suppose. And then I'm going to ask this question, how ridiculous would it be for one person to pout because another person had a cupcake as well? Well, that would just simply be ridiculous. But today's lesson is about a prophet with a bad attitude that is resentful of God showing grace to sinners as God showed grace and mercy to himself. So, believers should celebrate God's grace being extended to all people. Now, what is grace? I came across the definition, and I'm going to have this on the board taped up here. I'm going to suggest that they copy this down because I really like this statement. Grace describes God's love of doing huge, breathtaking, shocking good for completely, absolutely undeserving people. It's another way that I have defined grace is God being good to us for no good reason. And that lesson is illustrated by God's act of grace towards the Ninevites. What we're going to see in this lesson is an examination of the spirit of Jonah in our own hearts. The first point is contempt. Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. And again, I have this definition of contempt, and I'm going to put this on the board for point 1. The act of despising, looking down on with disrespect, willful disobedience to or open disrespect of a court, judge, or legislative body. In the news this week, they had a man by the name of Darrell Brooks, Jr. He's the man that drove through a parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin. He killed 6 people and he injured a dozen other people. Well, he went to court this week and he wouldn't obey the judge's authority when the judge asked him to be quiet and to stop interrupting. He's representing himself, and the judge told him, if you don't stop, I'm going to have you removed from the courtroom. And of course, he wouldn't stop and he was removed. And they put him in another room where the judge could see him and his actions, and he could hear the court proceedings. He was showing this disrespect, this willful disobedience for this person of authority. And that is this idea of contempt, the act of despising, looking down with disrespect, a willful disobedience or open disrespect of those who are in authority. And this describes Jonah. It says Jonah was greatly displeased. It is an emphasis. It's magnifying. This is a big unhappiness in Jonah. And this is how it was expressed, and became furious because of this big unhappiness. He prayed to the Lord, please, Lord, isn't this what I said while I was still in my own country? Now we discover why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. It wasn't so much that he was fearful of the Ninevites. We're going to see he was concerned about their response of repentance. That's why I fled towards Tarshish in the first place. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, and one who relents from sending disaster. And now, Lord, take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. The Lord asked, is it right for you to be angry? Now, verse 2 is a happy verse. Think about these words. I knew that you are gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, and one who relents from sending disaster. But this is a passage that ought to be read in a happy voice, in a joyful tone. But that's not the way that it's stated by Jonah. This very happy verse is stated with anger. Can you imagine the conflict of that? In fact, there may be someone in your class that feel comfortable enough and they could read that verse angry and then have someone read it joyfully. That's why it's so amazing what's happening in Jonah. It says that he's gracious. This word is used 13 times in the Old Testament. It's only associated with God, and we talked about what grace was. It says that he's compassionate. It's the idea, the meaning is soft like a womb. It's describing someone, it's describing a mother and the care and the feelings that she has for the baby that is beneath her heart. And the Hebrew looked at that and he said she's compassionate. And that describes the actions of people who are thoughtful and do tender actions towards people. I have known women who maybe drank alcohol or they smoked cigarettes, and when they learned that they were pregnant, then for those months they stopped drinking alcohol and stopped smoking cigarettes because of their compassion for their child. They had this tenderness, but it also was coupled with action. Slow to anger. This literally is long nose. And the idea was it took a longer time for the nose to be flush red with anger, but it has the idea of patience and forbearance and postponing anger. And Jonah is saying, I know that you're a God that is slow to anger, and aren't you grateful? God is slow to anger. And he says, abounding in love. This is another word that has the idea of compassion, but this word has about it the idea of steadfastness, of loyal love, of the fact that God binds himself, enters into a covenant with people. And so these are 4 ways that he understood about the living God. And then when you get to this last verse, basically what he says in verse 3 is, I'm better off dead than alive. And God asks him in verse 4, are you truly justified in being angry? And so it's a man that is holding these things in contempt. Now Jonah shows contempt for Nineveh, but in showing contempt for Nineveh, he's showing contempt for God. So how would you describe Jonah at this time? If you knew a person like this, what are the words that you would use to describe him? And I'd write those on the board, maybe self-absorbed or self-pity or prideful or delusions of grandeur, a lack of reliance upon God, just any number of things that the class lists. And then the point that I want to draw is if these things are in a person's life, they're becoming less like God instead of more like God. And so when we find those things in our life, then that's a testimony of where God is at work in our life to change us. The bottom line is that these people, like this, do not celebrate the grace of God. Now, these are signs of a person becoming less like God. Now, to close this point out, I'm going to ask the class to take a hymnal, which we have in the class, and turn to the hymn Amazing Grace by John Newton. And I'm asking them, would you read over that hymn and share with me someone how Jonah would actually sing the first verse of Amazing Grace and the second verse and so forth. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Well, Jonah would sing Amazing Grace, how awful the sound. And that kind of thing. And what I'm wanting to point out is this hymn, Amazing Grace, is a celebration of the grace of God. This is what is to be happening in the life of a believer. He's amazed by grace. He's grateful for grace. But Jonah's a man who is not celebrating the grace of God. And can you imagine? It's something that's awful. It's something he scorns, that he doesn't want to share. So believers should celebrate God's grace being extended to all people. And when we're resentful of that, it shows us that we're becoming less like God and rather than more like God. The second point is anger. Jonah chapter 4, verses 5 through 9. And again, I have a definition of anger, and I'll put this on the board as we talk about this point. A strong feeling of displeasure and usually of antagonism, which is talking about actively expressed opposition or hostility. And I'll leave that on the board as we talk about this issue of anger. Now, people get angry when their expectations are not met or thwarted. So as I read through the text, look for Jonah's expectations that he had that weren't met. So Jonah left the city and found a place east of it. Now, it's interesting that any time in the Bible somebody moves towards the east, they're headed for trouble. Cain lived east of Eden. Lot moved east of Abraham. And Jonah was hoping in the last hour God would turn and destroy Nineveh. So Jonah left the city. He found a place east of it. He made himself a shelter there and sat in its shade to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God appointed a plant. This word appointed we saw in the previous lesson. It's used 4 times in this passage, and it's simply saying it does God's will. God appointed a fish. It did God's will. It swallowed Jonah, kept him alive for 3 days. Here is a plant. It does God's will. It grows up and provides shade. There's a worm that's going to be appointed, and it attacks the plant. It's a military word, and it destroys the plant. It did God's will. And then there's this hot wind that comes, and it was appointed by God, and it did the will. Everybody does the will of God except the prophet of God. And he was the one that was appointed to go to Nineveh. Then the Lord appointed a plant, and it grew over Jonah to provide shade for his head to rescue him from his trouble. Jonah was greatly pleased with the plant. Now, in verse 1, it talked about it was a big unhappiness. It was greatly displeasing. Here, the word has about it greatly pleased. It's a big happiness. So he's greatly unhappy because of what's happened to the city of Nineveh, a city of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and he's really happy over this plant that's growing up. It's showing that kind of contrast in Jonah. Verse 7, when dawn came the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant, and it withered. As the sun was rising, God appointed a scorching east wind. The sun beat down on Jonah's head so much that he almost fainted, and he wanted to die. And he said, his wanting to die, here's what he was thinking. It's better for me to die than to live. So Jonah is hot. And so God brings heat to deal with the hotness in Jonah's attitude. So what were Jonah's expectations that led him to be angry? And what I'm looking at is, what was he expecting God to do? And how did he view God in these matters? Now let's just flip this on its head. Instead of getting angry that his expectations were not met, let's say he reaffirms that God is wise and gracious. If Jonah had responded in an opposite way, what would he have learned about this God that he served? He would have seen, just to give some examples to get things going, and what I'm looking for from the classes, he would have seen that this God is big-hearted, that his heart is much larger than Jonah ever imagined. He could actually love Ninevites. That ought to put Jonah in awe of the greatness of this God. It makes sense that he would love Jonah and love the Israelites, but the fact that he loves Ninevites, how amazing is this God's love? And not only that, he's so powerful, he could save Ninevites. These awful, horrible pagans, these cruel people, God could actually convert those people. What powerful saving power he has. He could have said, he's a forgiving God. I knew that he was a forgiving God. I had no idea the depth and the breadth of his forgiveness. That's what I'm saying. Look what he's missing out on in terms of his experience with God because of his anger. God didn't meet his expectations, and it blinds him to everything that he could have learned about God. Well, what would he have learned about himself? If he had backed up at some point and recognized his anger and his pettiness and his self-absorption, what could he have learned about himself? That's a question to the class. Well, he would have seen that he is petty. He would have seen his bias, his prejudice, his racial mindset. He would have seen his exclusiveness. He would have exposed his ungracious heart. There was so much there that he could have learned. In other words, if we'll take a moment to learn from our anger, it can give us tremendous insights into our own life and even into our relationship with God. Years ago, I came across a process that helps a person deal with anger, and it's called ABC. A stands for activating event, B stands for your beliefs about that event, and C stands for choices. So there's ABC, activating event, your beliefs about that event, and then the choice. And it had been very helpful to me over the years when it comes to dealing with my anger. For example, activating event. Let's say somebody cuts you off as you're driving to church, and they're driving foolishly or not carefully. And so that causes you to get angry. So why is it that some people get angry and some people don't get angry? Why does one person think that that person is an idiot and another person, it just barely bothers them, and they wind up at church and they're just as calm as when they left the house? It's because of B. Both of them are telling themselves something about that activating event, and their beliefs are informing them about the choice that they should make. And one of the ways to deal with anger in a healthy and positive way is when you get angry, if you could just take a moment to examine why am I angry? What is it that I'm telling myself about this? And then in examining your beliefs, you can see what is the right choice to make. And the practice often helps to do so with a journal, because what happens is we get angry and we're just instantly mad about something, and we're not even aware of the belief that we're following and the choice that we're making. So what happens with journaling is if you can write this down, it helps you begin to give yourself a little bit of space between your anger and your choice. Jonah took no time to evaluate his own life. If he had, he might have seen what a tremendously gracious God this is. He might have seen how little his heart was and how God wanted to expand it. Believers should celebrate God's grace being extended to all people. The third point is compassion. And again, I've taken the word compassion and I've written it out on one of these sheets, and I'll put it on the board during the point. Sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. And the consistent thing I found about compassion is it carried those two concepts, this awareness of someone's condition and a sympathy for that, but compassion moves a person to actually do something of help to that person. That's compassion. So, I want you to see something in this text. Verse 10, and the Lord said, so there's one main action that's taking place. And this is what the Lord said. You cared about the plant, which you did not labor over and did not grow. It appeared in the night and perished in a night. So what I'm going to do on the board is I'm going to write "you cared" and then dash plant. And then I just simply want to point out what he says about it. You didn't labor over this plant. You didn't grow this plant. It had nothing to do with this plant. And the second quality that he mentions about it is it appeared in a night and it perished in a night. But you cared about a plant. And then I'm going to draw a line, and then I'm going to say, but God cared about people. And notice what it says. It's a contrast here. You cared about a plant. Now notice verse 11. So may I not care about the great city of Nineveh. You see what he's setting up Jonah to see? You've cared about a plant. You got happy about a plant. You got angry over the fact that people weren't destroyed. He goes on to say, which has more than 120,000 people who cannot distinguish between their right and their left. It's a way of saying they were spiritually ignorant. They didn't know about the living God. They didn't know how to repent and to seek the living God. It's amazing. What he's pointing out. You got angry and you cared about a plant. You didn't have anything to do with this plant. It springs up one night, it's gone one night. And yet what you're upset about is 120,000 caskets are not filled with dead Ninevites. I mean, it's a shocking contrast that he's making here. And then this little statement, as well as many animals. What in the world is that about? Well, Jonah is concerned about a plant. Well, how about an animal, Jonah? Do you care about an animal? But in a sense, he's talking about their economics. I mean, their life is built around cattle and their herds. And so if you destroy a nation's economy, you're going to destroy people. The amount of suffering that's going to come into people's lives when you destroy their economy. And in a sense, that's what he's saying. He's saying, you didn't care about the lives of 120,000 people. You didn't even care about their economy that would have destroyed many, many more lives. It's a powerful contrast that he's making here. And this still happens today. What have you seen Christians prioritize over reaching the lost? I'm talking about buildings. We all know stories of the bus children. Do they still have bus ministries today? We know stories about these children that we bring in, and they're not church broke yet. And people are anxious and concerned about their building and these children running amok and abusing the building. And maybe it's people who aren't, quote, our people. We're not really interested in reaching those kinds of people. Or maybe it's some ineffective program that we simply won't release and retire so that we can spend the money and the energies of people on things that are more effective. What is it that you've seen in which Christian people have prioritized something else over reaching people who are lost? What kind of people do you have a particular spot for, and why? My mother told me a story of my father when he was a boy, and my father was raised very poor, and she told about how there would be times when he was hungry. My grandmother told me a story about a time when she didn't have anything in the house, and she prayed and asked God, please provide something for my children, and how God miraculously provided eggs and flour and milk for her the next morning to fix pancakes for her children. And so what my mother was telling me was affirmed by my grandmother. And so because of that, I have an affection. I have an interest in people who are hungry. And every year in our denomination, in October, the second Sunday, our denomination takes up an offering for hunger relief. And as long as I've been a pastor, we've taken up an offering on the second Sunday in October for hunger relief. And part of that motivation for me is a dad who grew up hungry. See, that's what's given me a compassion, a soft spot for that. And that's what I'm asking you. What kind of people do you have a soft spot for? And why is that? Well, and then after the classes had discussion, it seems that God is saying to Jonah, if you could see people the way that I see people, then you would want to extend care to them like I want to extend care to them. This word that is used for care is a word that is found in the scriptures, and one of the things that it's often associated with is the eye. Let me give you some passages for that. Would be like Ezekiel 16, verse 5, and Ezekiel 20, verse 17, and it talks about God's compassion as he sees people. And so it seems to me that if Jonah could see people the way God saw people, then maybe his heart would soften towards the Ninevites. He just doesn't see them that way. Now, to close the lesson, I'm going to give every member of the class a 3x5 card. And I'm going to ask them to write 3 names on one side. People that's in their life. Could be family members, could be co-workers, could be a neighbor. Just what 3 names come to mind that's in their life. And then I'm going to ask them to flip the card, and on the back side, write 3 things you could do to show care for that person. What are 3 things you can do, not just feel, but you could do to show care for that person? Because you see, believers should celebrate God's grace being extended to all people. And how does he often do that? He does that through you and through me. God bless you for teaching God's word. Thank you.